Hi, friends. I'm Father Kerry Walters, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. Angry atheists who reject Christianity as irrational and anti-intellectual, as well as equally angry Christian fundamentalists who believe that any kind of learning is a threat to the faith, would be equally surprised, perhaps, to discover that there is a traditional strain of Christianity that is properly called humanism. Christian humanism is that position which argues that human beings have a God-given dignity that ought to be respected. It values liberty of conscience, free inquiry, and reason. Reason not as a threat to faith, but as a complement to faith. Probably one of the world's greatest Christian humanists is the Northern Renaissance man Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus died in 1536, just short of his 70th birthday. He did more than any other person I can think of, except perhaps John Colet and Thomas More, who were both friends of Erasmus's, to encourage a return to the devotion and simplicity of the apostolic age, while at the same time cherishing what the classics, what secular learning can contribute to Christian formation and Christian understanding. Erasmus began to make a name for himself early in the 16th century with a wonderful book, still eminently readable, entitled Handbook for the Christian Militant. Don't be deceived by the title. What Erasmus means by militant in the title is a Christian who is utterly and completely devoted to his or her faith, one who takes the faith seriously or militantly. And it is basically a handbook that enjoins the reader to return to the simplicity of the early church, to separate wheat from chaff, to recognize that genuine spirituality consists both in an interior peace and calm and exterior loving actions. Probably Erasmus's most famous book is a little treatise entitled The Praise of Folly. It's a satire with a very serious message, and that message is that what the world generally takes to be wisdom is in fact foolishness in the eyes of God, and what the world takes to be foolishness is in fact wisdom in the eyes of God. About 5 years after The Praise of Folly was published, Erasmus writes another book that has become a classic in what today we would call political science. It's Instruction of a Christian Prince. Came out in about 1516. It was written as a tutorial for Prince Charles, who would later become the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. And in that particular book, what Erasmus tries to do is to teach Charles how a Christian prince ought to comport himself. And that comportment includes forgiveness and love and compassion and charity. It's instructive to compare that tutorial for a prince with one written at about the same time by Niccolò Machiavelli, simply entitled The Prince. As everyone knows, Machiavelli offers advice that is just about as contrary to the advice offered by Erasmus as one can imagine. It's a shame, isn't it, that Machiavelli's book seems to have had more influence ultimately than Erasmus's. But the book that I think best personifies the spirit of Erasmus and the spirit of Christian humanism is one that isn't read as widely as The Praise of Folly, but which I think is every bit as good. It's Querela Pacis, The Complaint of Peace. And in that particular book, what Erasmus wants to do is to argue against what he sees as an increasing amount of violence, not only between nations, but also between persons. And not only between persons, but within individuals as well. The Complaint of Peace is a wonderful brief for the tranquility which Christianity offers. Erasmus starts out by arguing that harmony and concord are in point of fact characteristic of the world, of the reality in which we live. He says if you look at the stars and the planets in the solar system, you discover quite quickly that they coexist with one another harmoniously. Their existence is orderly and predictable. If you look at the non-human animal world, you'll see the same thing. Animals tend to cooperate one another if they belong to the same species. They don't kill one another wantonly or gleefully. Vegetation, says Erasmus, likewise, is of a pacific and harmonious nature. Flowers and plants and vines can live beside one another without stifling one another. Even health, he wants to argue, bodily health is a reflection of concord and harmony, in which all of the different parts of the body cooperate and collaborate with one another in order to create what you might call a state of peace. It is only human beings in all of God's vast creation who seem to gleefully engage in violence against one another. This fact absolutely floors Erasmus, because you would think that it would be precisely humans who would reject violence of any kind. And why is that? Well, because violence is destructive of well-being. Violence is irrational. Violence is born of passion and hatred and jealousy and greed. And beings who are created in the image and likeness of God, so you would think, would shy away from such actions and such attitudes. And what is bizarre for humans in general is even more bizarre for Christians in particular, says Erasmus. Christians follow the Prince of Peace, and if there was a single message that runs throughout all of Christ's teaching, it is avoid violence. Violence is never desirable. Violence is never virtuous. And yet Erasmus looks at the world in which he lives, and he sees Christians killing Christians and Christians killing non-Christians, and doing so in the name of Christ. At one point in The Complaint of Peace, he mentions how startled he is that Christian soldiers will baptize their artillery with the names of the 12 apostles, and will even carve crosses and other holy insignia into the sides of the cannon. How bizarre, how repugnant Erasmus finds that kind of behavior, because once again, it goes completely against the Spirit of Christ. Erasmus says to his readers that they have a stark choice. Either renounce violence or renounce the name of Christian. It is just as simple as that. But he also recognizes that the people in society who hold most responsibility for the continuation of violence, especially violence perpetrated in the name of Christianity, are the secular rulers on the one hand and the clergy on the other. Secular rulers, Erasmus argues, are not the sole owners of a country. A king is not the sole possessor of everything within his domain. God is the sole possessor of that domain, and the king is nothing but God's servant, and consequently, the king ought to honor the wishes of God. And the wishes of God have been made manifest in the life and teachings of Christ. Erasmus is even more scornful of clergy who preach and even practice violence, bishops who take off cope and mitre and put on armor and sword, popes who preach holy crusades, not only against non-Christians, but also against other Christians, regular clergy who from the pulpit incite anger and hatred in their congregations by preaching fire and brimstone sermons directed against this group of people or that group of people. The twin sources of violence, whether one is speaking about violence between nations or between persons or within an individual, are, says Erasmus, false ambitions on the one hand and evil or wicked desires on the other. It should be the job of clergy to try and point out undesirable ambitions and desires and help the people whom they minister to overcome them. It should be the responsibility of rulers to enact laws that encourage people to move away from unworthy ambitions and unworthy desires. And to the extent that rulers and clergy not only fail to do this, but actually encourage unworthy ambitions and desires, they fail in their job. Erasmus writes all of this with a passion which is palpable, but also with arguments which are breathtaking in their simplicity and their rational rigor. He is, as I said earlier, a paragon of Christian humanism. He represents for us the best of the wedding that can occur when faith and reason cooperate with one another. And I certainly do encourage all of you out there to get yourselves a copy of Erasmus's The Complaint of Peace and meditate on it. Because it's not only of historical interest, my friends, in our day and age, it is also of great relevance. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much.